Charles H. Wright was an obstetrician and gynecologist who would offer his medical knowledge during the civil rights protests. He also had a self-published book, The Medical Association Demand Equality Opportunity. He was a cool guy. During some traveling, he visited Denmark, where he saw a World War II monument. There, he got the idea for the International Afro-American Museum. He would announce it in 1965, eventually adding a traveling exhibit. The museum provided exhibits on civil rights activists, inventors, artifacts Dr. Wright purchased while traveling Nigeria and Ghana. The museum continued to outgrow buildings until 1997, where it still stands today. In 1998, the museum would be named the Charles H. Wright African American Museum. If you're ever in Detroit, check it out. The perm has been around since the 1850s. It's not going anywhere. To be clear, I'm talking about chemical relaxers today. But have you ever thought about who made the first perm? You probably thought Madam C.J. Walker, but she was selling hair growth formula, not perms. The answer is actually Garrett Morgan. Yes, the same Garrett Morgan that invented the smoke hood, gas mask, and traffic light. In 1905, Garrett's experimenting with sewing machine fluid. After dinner one night, he noticed one of the mixtures he had made straightened the fibers on an old rag. He decided to test it. He permed the neighbor's dog, not once, not twice, but 3 times. After deciding the dog was fine, he tested it on himself. He didn't take this to market right away. For 4 years, Garrett Morgan was the only black person with a chemical perm before he took it to market in 1909. But he kept his perm forever. That's how Garrett Morgan invented the first chemical perm. Sometimes history is funny like that. In the year 1900, a group of black people in their late 20s, Jesse W. Watkins, Harper S. Fortune, Walter A. Johnson, and Walter W. Wallace, moved from Virginia to Boston to open a publishing company. There, they published the Colored American magazine, covering photography, poetry, serialized fiction, black achievements, and essays. The magazine quickly passed 15,000 subscriptions in a year. Booker T. Washington, Ella Wheeler, W.E.B. Du Bois, and notably Pauline Hopkins all contributed. Pauline would become the editor and push content to the left, dealing with discrimination, lynchings, sexual assault, and social justice. In 1904, Fred R. Moore purchased the magazine and replaced Pauline with Booker T. Washington as editor in a hostile takeover. The magazine began to focus on middle-of-the-road politics, and circulation dropped to 1,200 before the magazine died. Du Bois would state that it was a shame for Pauline's work to die a peaceful and unnoticed death, but it did go on to inspire The Crisis, Ebony, and Jet. Ted Patrick is a black man born in 1930. He's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. In 10th grade, he dropped out of school to support his family. At 25, he became known as a prominent activist during the Watts riots. Then he started abducting people for a living. Let me explain. Patrick would mention that his son had fallen in with the Children of God, now known as the Family International. It's a cult. Ted would go undercover when he learned of a large number of teenagers and young adults who had fallen in. Ted goes through their program and starts Free Children of God to deprogram these people. People start contacting him to get their family back afterwards. Despite plenty of criminal and civil trials, Ted is still a free man today, credited with deprogramming over 1,000 people and helping them escape from cults. That's why he's called the father of deprogramming. Christina May Thomas is born in Louisiana, and in 1943, she does something rare for a woman, especially a black woman at that time. She graduates Leland College with a degree in science. She falls in love with Herman Duke Jenkins, a jazz pianist. The two of them move to Chicago, and in 1949, Christina, now Jenkins, is sitting in a wig factory thinking of a better way to secure a wig. She came up with the idea of sewing it to the scalp, and thus the sewing was born. She didn't take it to her bosses. She got to Chicago before they figured out what was going on. Christina and her husband moved to Ohio, where they began teaching her technique. She sold her technique and style as hair weave. It was advertised as adding length and body. In 1952, she's given a patent for the technique, and let's be real, it took off like wildfire. Stephanie Tubbs Jones, a congresswoman from Ohio, praised Jenkins, claiming that her invention changed the world, and she wasn't lying. In 1875, Cornelia Graves is born as the youngest of 9 children. She works hard, graduates from Prairie View A&M University, then earns her teaching certificate. In 1907, she leaves Dallas and goes to Stephenville, Texas. There, she takes a job at Bethesda Colored School, a new school with just 12 students. For the next 20 years, she will work as the only teacher and principal of the school. She also worked as a Sunday school superintendent during the time. While in Stephenville, she would marry Civil War veteran John Graves. Graves. When John became ill with tuberculosis, they would move to Amarillo for better treatment. There, she would continue her teaching career. Even when she left Stephenville, they named the new school after her in 1951. In 1960, Graves would pass away, but her legacy would live on. In 2012, Texas would dedicate a historical monument to her, making sure that her name would never be forgotten. In 1944, World War II was hard. The troops are not receiving any mail and are becoming discouraged. Mary McLeod Bethune, a civil rights activist and friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, says, maybe you can find a job for black women to do besides cook and clean. So they did. 6,888 Battalion, nicknamed 6 AAA, was formed. A battalion made up of black women led by Major Charity Adams. When they arrived in Birmingham, England, they found over 2 years of mail waiting, with more coming in each day. At one point, a white general sent a group of white men to show them how it was done, but Major Charity Adams told them that would happen over her dead body. By 1945, they had cleared out 2 years of stored mail and had their numbers cut by 300. In 1946, they had another 200 cut from their ranks before the war ended. The group was quietly disbanded and was not recognized until 2009, when they were honored by President Barack Obama and the First Lady Michelle Obama, as well as the Arlington Cemetery for their Women in Military Service Memorial. Their motto was no mail, low morale. That's not how I say morale, but they weren't exactly wrong. 1922, on the island of Trinidad in Diego Martin, Rosa Cuthbert is born. She would move to Harlem, New York with her parents in 1932. She got married at 19 to Warner Guy. When he returned from World War II, they only lasted 5 years. After the divorce, Rosa Guy pursued a career in writing. She founded the Harlem Writers Guild alongside John Oliver Killens. It would grow to include Maya Angelou, Ruby Dee, Ossie Davis, and many more. Most of her books would focus on familial and platonic drama that can come with being a young adult. Novels like My Love, and Ruby or Edith Jackson would gain the most notoriety. She was known for writing plays as well. Her most interesting piece, in my opinion, is Children of Longing, where she traveled to interview young adults on their thoughts of the future after the assassination of Martin Luther King. A high caliber writer on her own with an influence that can be felt in the pages of many. Rosa Guy is nothing short of a phenom. Marion Stokes is born on November 25th, 1929. For 20 years, she works as a librarian at the Free Library of Philadelphia. She invests some money in Apple during this time, until one day in the mid to late 60s, she's fired because the FBI spies on her and outs her as an organizer for the Communist Party. She attempts to defect to Cuba with her first husband, but fails. In 1967, she and her future second husband, John Stokes Sr., began making the TV show Input, where they bring in communists, socialists, religious leaders, artists, and more discuss justice issues in the city. Apple blows up and she gets very rich. Like many people, she tapes the occasional TV show or movie. Then the Iran-Contra scandal happens and she records everything, enlisting her children, driver, secretary, and friends to help. Over 71,000 tapes, and people talk about sitcoms, but it's mostly news from the Iran-Contra scandal to Sandy Hook as she died, because in her words, the winners write history and she wanted to set the record straight and protect the truth. Minstrel shows, a 19th century form of entertainment in which white people would put on blackface for the purpose of playing idiots and enslaved people. At one point, it was one of the most popular forms of entertainment and kept going from the mid-1800s all the way to the 1970s. Recently, there have been some internet personalities that have had the idea related to them. Often the defense is that black people can't do minstrel shows, but that's a lie. William Henry Lane and Thomas Dilworth became the first black men to perform minstrel shows. The original Georgia minstrels dominated for a decade alongside Sam Hague's Slave Troupe and Rabbitfoot minstrels. There were black people who performed in minstrel shows, hoping to capitalize on the racism, no matter the harm or shame it might bring to other black people. So yes, the black people making these videos are doing minstrels. Black people supported them because it was the only way black people could get on stage in America for a long time. But in 2023, we don't need to do that anymore. You like vanilla ice cream. It's simple, smooth, no aftertaste. Unfortunately, if you were black before the Jim Crow era ended, you couldn't have any. Except Independence Day. We're all Americans that day, no matter what our skin color is. My grandfather used to joke about it, but there's no written law saying black people can't have vanilla ice cream. However, there's just too many elderly black people saying we couldn't have that for it to not be true. My grandfather, Maya Angelou, Audre Lorde, Frederick Douglass, they can't all be lying now. So what did people choose instead? Some chose chocolate, a top 5 choice for sure. Others chose strawberry, that's a good one. Many people love the sweetness of butter pecan, so it became a staple for generations. generations. Now, I can go to the store and buy vanilla ice cream for a few dollars, but me and my house shall eat butter pecan and strawberry. Black people can all agree on the flavor. We just have to agree on pecan, or pecan. There's this idea that black people haven't been everywhere in history, and once again, that's just not true. Around 1720, there's a man named Jack in Ireland. His parents are an interracial couple, but he's on the darker side. Still, he's a free man. Slave traders kidnap him from Ireland and sell him as a slave in Antigua. In 1736, Jack is given the nickname Mulatto Jack and arrested. Why was Jack arrested? Because Jack had been plotting a slave rebellion and things were starting to pick up. They hold Jack for months because they don't know what to do with him. If they kill him, the uprising is coming for sure. If they let him go, the uprising is coming for sure. So they put him on a boat and sent him back to Ireland. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Have a drink for Jack, not St. Patrick. That's a different story for another time. Harriet Tubman's operations on the Underground Railroad are legendary in the history of resistance movements. Luckily, Harriet wasn't out there alone. Many men and women were as dedicated to the cause as she was. So let's talk about one, Aunt Polly Jackson. We don't know a lot about Polly's past, but she was once a fugitive on the Underground Railroad until she was offered some land in Africa, Ohio, where she began her farm. She would offer housing for those passing through, but one day decided that wasn't enough. Knowing slave catchers had been the area too often, she decided to dress up as an old lady. Doing this allowed her to get close, then she'd attack them with a butcher knife and a kettle of boiling water. She was about that action and would set free any captured slaves and lead them to safety. Family or not, she is your auntie. John Jay was born in Nigeria during 1773. His entire family was kidnapped, broken up, and sold into slavery. The couple that enslaved John would send him to church as a punishment, but he only became a devout Christian preacher and all-around troublemaker. While slave masters would use the Bible and say things like, "Bless the rod and him that delivereth it," John would take the lashings and respond with, "God is love, and whoso dwelleth in love, dwelleth in God." John was inspiring to enslaved people as he continued to point out the hypocrisy of slave owner Christianity. For this, he was sold and bought over and over again, using religion as a way to inspire other slaves. Finally, he told one owner, "Either kill me or let me go, because I'm not gonna stop," and that's how John became a free man. He spent the rest of his life traveling the northern United States, South America, and Europe teaching Christianity, but also how to read, because he felt it was a key to freedom. His autobiography became one of the first written by a former slave. It's called The Life, History, and Unparalleled Sufferings of John Jay, the African Preacher, compiled and written by himself. In French Guadalupe, there's a statue of a pregnant woman known simply as La Mulatrice Solitude, the female mulatto of solitude. She was conceived in 1772 when her mother was raped at sea by a sailor transporting her to the West Indies. In 1779, the French abolished slavery. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte said, "Run it back," and she said, "Nah." A white officer, Joseph Ignatz, and free mulatto officer, Louis Delgrace, put together separate militias but joined with abolitionist groups from Guadalupe. When the French army arrived on May 21st, 1802, and the fighting began, suddenly there was this visibly pregnant woman fighting on the front lines. When the fighting was done on May 28, 1802, she was among those captured. She was pregnant. They waited until November 29th, the day after she gave birth to hang her. Nobody knows her real name, but legends of this woman have survived centuries and given rise to statues, musicals, literature, and eternal life to the words they all chanted with others fighting, "Live free or die." The push to make MLK Day a holiday starts in 1968 when Representative John Conyers introduces a motion to make it a federal holiday. It doesn't pass, but he keeps doing it for 11 years straight before he gets a vote for it in 1979. The vote fails, but people reorganize. Stevie Wonder releases a song called Happy Birthday in celebration of Dr. King. There's a march on Washington put together by the King Center and Coretta Scott King, and then 6 million people sign a petition. It goes up for a second vote, this time in the House, with bipartisan support, including Newt Gingrich giving a speech in favor of the holiday. The Senate is a little different. They tried to filibuster the bill, and when that didn't work, they provided a 400-page document claiming Dr. King was a communist. The bill manages to get passed in a single vote. President Reagan signs it into law stating 1986 would be the first year with MLK Day as a federal holiday. Ctis Collins was born September 24th, 1931 in St. Louis. Her family moved to Detroit, and when she became of age, she attended Northwestern University in Illinois. After she worked as a revenue auditor for Chicago, she married U.S. Congressman George Collins, and they had a son. Unfortunately, George died in a plane crash. People immediately turned to Ctis to run for his seat. She said the same thing Rosa Parks said when they told her to get up. Nah. She said she was too shy and had no interest in the spotlight. Just so people would leave her alone, she jumps in at the end of the race. She wins both the primary and general election with ease. She becomes the first woman and first black person to be whip at large for the Democratic Party, leads the Congressional Black Caucus, fights for better healthcare and public welfare. She serves for 25 years from 1972 until 1997, most of which she was the only black woman in Congress. Pretty good for someone who didn't want the job. You ever heard of the Patterson Greenfield automobile? It came from the C.R. Patterson and Sons Company. The company was started by Charles Richard Patterson, a former slave who escaped Virginia and settled in Greenfield, Ohio. There, he worked as a blacksmith and formed a relationship with a white carriage company owner named J.P. Lowe. The two went into business in 1873 selling and repairing carriages. They did great until the auto industry took off. Fred Patterson is C.R.'s son and the first black person to play football for Ohio State. He takes over the company from his father in 1910 and switches over to making cars to compete with the Ford Model T. But Ford is a juggernaut, so they switched buses and other vehicles to carve out their own niche. Unfortunately, the Great Depression put an end to Patterson and Sons like so many other businesses. In 1976, at a benefit dinner for the United Negro College Fund, Arthur Ashe meets and falls in love with Genie Matusi, an award-winning photographer and artist. She's the daughter of John Matusi, an architect, and as I record this, he is still the only black person to design a high-rise building in Chicago's downtown. She had been inspired to pursue photography by Gordon Parks, who had been impressed by her work for news stations and newspapers years before. She's had photos published in Jet, Ebony, Essence, the Smithsonian, and so on. Today, she's won countless awards, has permanent collections on display inside and outside the United States. One private display is in possession of Oprah Winfrey, who was never shy about being a fan. That's a power couple. Born in Virginia in 1903, Ella Baker became known as the mother of civil rights, and for good reason. She graduated Shaw University and moved to New York City, where she began organizing around 1930. In 1940, she joined the NAACP. She's good at it, and Martin Luther King Jr. recruits her to join the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1960, she learns of black students being denied service at Woolworth's lunch counter, so she quits the SCLC to start the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She moved on to organizing and fundraising to push for the Civil Rights Act to be passed. Even on her deathbed in 1986, she was still working as an activist and calling for an end to apartheid in South Africa. In 1951, a tobacco farm worker named Henrietta Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer after a difficult pregnancy. Without her knowledge, they took cell samples. Without the knowledge of even the sample takers, a doctor named George Otto Gay made copies of her. They were the first to survive more than just a few days, so he passed them out like candy. They named the cells HeLa, H-E-L-A, and used them to perform experiments outside the human body for the first time. Despite the medical advances brought by her cells, she died at 31. They used the cells to test AIDS treatments, cancer treatments, cosmetics, glue, over 11,000 different medications and products. She wasn't even recognized until 1996 when someone at Morehouse decided this had gone on long enough and recognized her at the first ever HeLa Women's Health Conference.